We see the main slide.
Perfect. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Irina Chufrai. I am currently a PhD student in the sociology department at UC Davis. I'm also a fellow with the Penn Migration Initiative, which is a part of a partnership with the Penn Birmingham Transatlantic Fellows Program at University of Birmingham in the UK. Today, I'd like to share with you some in-progress work and ask for your suggestions and advice as I move forward from this work, which I am building upon and proposing something new for my dissertation prospectus. This is also a longer version of a presentation that I will be sharing at a conference next week. So this is a great time for me to just ask for advice in general. So I look forward to your comments. The objective of my study, which I didn't even say the name, my study is Immigrants, Age at Arrival, Social Capital, and College Enrollment. The objective of my study is to tease apart different amounts of exposure to US society and see how that exposure by age at arrival may be related to college enrollment. Specifically, I look at 1.5 generation youth, which is defined as foreign-born youth, those who arrived in the US under the age of 18. This study has several contributions. Consider the context that there are over 2 million immigrant children in the US, but in terms of our research and how we do our research, there's actually a lack of consensus in classifying 1.5 generation. Some scholars lump together all students who arrived anywhere between 0 and 17 into the 1.5 generation. Some take younger arrivals and put them together with second generation, which typically refers to US-born students. The issue here is that there are differences in the acculturation experiences of students depending on when they arrive to the US in early childhood, middle childhood, or as an adolescent. Consider, for example, language proficiency and how that affects students' experiences. For instance, in terms of interacting with school personnel, in my case with school staff, such as guidance counselors, and talking about college going and what role that may play. There are also data challenges. For researchers such as myself, interested in studying the 1.5 generation, it turns out there aren't too many data sources with that amount of detail. A lot of data can tell us if a person is foreign-born. Some smaller amount of data can tell us which generation, first, second, or third, but very few can actually tell us at the level of the age or the age group the students arrive. There's also a literature gap in understanding the role of age at arrival and how it affects students' educational outcomes, specifically their college-going pursuits, how age at arrival might influence students' search for college information is also gravely understudied. Age at arrival is an important factor to unravel because students arrive to the US at different stages of life, and so they have different experiences, such as experiences with access to social capital and knowledge that they have about how the world works specific to the US, such as how does college application system work in US? How do you do that? There are potentially different educational outcomes of students who arrive at different ages. If you consider that older arriving immigrant youth, for instance, tend to have a higher risk of exiting high school without a diploma, which then, of course, impacts their college-going perspectives, especially four-year college perspectives. Four-year college is really important to consider because it has become more than just a milestone. Employers are increasingly necessitating this degree in order to hire people. They actually preferentially hire individuals with a college degree and more so preferentially hire those with a four-year degree. We know from research in general about college going that it reduces population's rates of criminal activity. It, of course, boosts earnings, it improves family stability, and it helps us to live healthier lives in general. But the payoff is just not in those returns that we get. The payoff is also in graduation itself. Please consider that completion rates at four-year institutions are much higher than at two-year or other institutions. On average, completion rates at four-year schools are about, on average, 60%. And for comparison, at two-year institutions, it's about 27%. With those considerations in mind, this study focuses on enrollment in four-year college. I also focus on the role of students speaking to counselors. Immigrant students may need additional support in navigating the college-going process if we consider language and not knowing how the whole process works. And research shows us that high school counselors are actually a common resource for college-specific social capital. Some studies indicate that college talk in general, the general student population, is associated with significantly increased odds of college going of any kind, whether it's a two-year or four-year. But what does it look like with immigrant youth, with foreign-born youth, 1.5 Gen? That we don't really know how counselors play a role with this population. Finally, I tease apart age at arrival a little bit differently than others have. Ramba is well known for advocating for these three stages that you see on your screen, from early to middle childhood to adolescence, with these three categories. But the middle childhood stage, 6 to 12, it's a large number, it's a large gap between 6 to 12 if we think that at age 6, the student is typically an elementary school student. At age 12, that's typically a middle school student. So I think those are actually different life stages. For this study, I have decided to follow the US school structure as a rough proxy for approximate life stages. So as a result, I use 4 categories that are in line with the US school structure, as you see, from preschool to elementary to middle and to high school age. This study addresses 4 main research questions. The first being, does age at arrival predict college going? Does social capital predict college going? Does age at arrival predict access to social capital? And does social capital explain the association between age at arrival and college going? The data set is from the High School Longitudinal Study that follows students from 2009 to 2016. It's nationally representative and follows a 2-stage random sample, first sampling from high school and then sampling from students within those high schools. We start with a pretty large number, about 25,000 students, and then the sample is narrowed substantially due to a number of parents declining to participate in the survey. And this is critical because I look at age at arrival, and it is the parents who were asked, what year did your child arrive in the US? And so if the parent did not take the survey, I don't have that variable. And also a number of students just chose not to participate. Finally, the outcome sample is smaller than the numbers that you see on the screen here, because I've also excluded youth who are US born and both parents are US born. Those are removed, and the final number comes down to just under 2,000. The survey itself began in 2009 when students were 9th graders. The survey was again given in 11th grade, but keep in mind that this was in the springtime, so they're actually almost seniors. We then have their high school transcript information in 2013, and in the final wave, we know what happened to the students with their outcomes 3 years after they graduated high school. There's one main limitation with this survey. It's longitudinal, yes, but it was not designed to actually study the responses of participants and how responses change over time, meaning the same questions were not asked over time. So that's something I cannot look at, but I can look at what happened to students in terms of their educational outcomes. These are the four broad categories of controls that I use, first being sociodemographics, then including some student characteristics such as their GPA, their L status, which is English language learner. I look at educational expectations from both students and parents, and finally social capital, which I operationalize as students indicating in the survey that they talk to someone, being a parent, teacher, school counselor, or friend, about college going specifically. You will also see in the next few slides that I take the demographic variables and divide them into two groups, one being exogenous demographics. These are not likely to be influenced by students' exposure to US, to the new country, and other demographics, which are likely to be influenced by the length of stay in the US. The main variable of interest, age at arrival, I've constructed from the difference between students' year of entry and their year of birth. Their year of birth is from the student's questionnaire, and what year did they actually come was from the parents' questionnaire. Would have been great if the survey asked the students too, but that's how it was done. I'd like to start off with some demographics, just very briefly. One thing that stands out here is that a greater proportion of the sample is actually from Asian background. And we see that with this bright yellow bar, especially in older arrivals, and less so across the second generation that I compare to. And once again, second generation is US born. Another thing I'd like to point out in the next slide, which is on enrollment 3 years after high school. So where do students end up? If we look at the high school diploma, which is this orange bar here, we can see just a slightly change among older arrivals, it being higher, that's where students ended. And if we look at the 4-year, which is the yellow bar, we see it just slightly going down. But again, this is just demographics. It's not more complex than that at this point. And the final demographics slide I'd like to share with you is the social capital measure. So did students talk to someone about college going? I look at talking with a counselor, with a teacher, 11th graders talking with a counselor, and whether the family talked with a counselor or teacher about their child going to college. 11th graders definitely stand out with this gray bar that you see, but keep in mind that 11th graders were surveyed in springtime, so that could be playing a big role here in why it appears that they were so much more likely and frequently to talk to a counselor about college going. So the first research question, does age and arrival predict college going? Here I use binary logistic regression, where I'm estimating the odds of 4-year college enrollment, specifically in Model 1. In Model 2, I'm adding those exogenous demographics that are listed at the bottom of your screen, and also other demographics in Model 3, also listed at the bottom of your screen. So this is showing us that relative to second generation, those who are US born, with at least one foreign-born parent, it appears as if 9th grade arrivals here have significantly lower odds of college going, which is something that we might predict. It's a 49% decrease in the predicted odds of enrollment. But unfortunately, I report this number with a great deal of caution. You might notice on your screen that it no longer says high school arrival, it says 9th grade arrival. I report this number with caution because it turns out that this group of students, when they came into US, schools most likely looked at their language proficiency, and based on that, moved students in 9th grade. It didn't matter that they were 15 or 16, they were moved into 9th grade. And unfortunately, the survey does not follow students to see how long they were in 9th grade, but they eventually moved out of 9th grade. That bit of information is unknown to us. And this particular sample is the smallest cell compared to the others. So I show it here, but with a great deal of caution. The takeaway point is actually not this, but in general, that younger arrivals, which is preschool arrival, do not have significantly greater college going outcomes as as we might expect to see because they've been in US longer, they've been exposed to US institutions longer. We do not see that here. The second question looks at whether social capital predicts college going. And if we recall, social capital is speaking to someone about college. Here I'm predicting college enrollment based on students speaking with school staff or others. Model 2 adds other social capital resources, whereas 3 and 4 add the demographics. One thing that stands out here is that 11th graders, remember they're almost seniors, they seem to talk to counselors and have significantly greater odds of college going. It's a 25% increase in their odds of college enrollment. But then by the time we add controls in model 3, that significance is no longer there. One thing that stands out about these 11th graders, which you are not able to see on the screen, but if I were to show the demographics below, the controls for demographics, I noticed that students coming from families where the parents, at least one parent, has a BA degree or higher, have statistically greater odds of college going. So maybe it's not 11th grade after all, maybe it's not the timing, maybe it's actually a factor of students coming from higher SES families, perhaps are more likely to be the ones to reach out to counselors. This implied relationship is something that I explored in the next table. Here it's predicting 11th grade students speaking with school staff about college, regressed on parent education and household income. No surprise, those with parents having a BA degree or more have greater odds of speaking to a counselor. And those coming from families in the very high end of household income also have greater odds of speaking to a counselor. So although the 11th graders seem to stand out, it's probably not about the timing. It might be more about where these students are coming from in terms of their family background. And overall, the table that we just looked at, it shows us that social capital, again, does not seem to predict college enrollment net of controls, as I might have hypothesized. I now move to the third out of 4 questions. Does age at arrival predict social capital access? This question is interesting because it was written and designed before the analysis was done, but I've already shared with you at this point that, well, age at arrival is not really associated with college going, at least not with this study. So I show this table just for completeness because it was done. All these numbers simply show one thing, that overall age at arrival is not predicting social capital access. And so it's not quite working how I hypothesized. This leads me to the final research question. Does social capital then explain the association between age at arrival and college going? Shouldn't be any surprises here since we've seen the other results. Model 1 here controls for social capital and exogenous demographics, while model 2 adds demographic controls. The main difference here is that we see school level age at arrival and social capital together in one model. The previous models did not have them together, but it's the same result. Social capital does not explain the effect on enrollment, which we know there isn't. We just have no results is basically what I'm seeing here. So then what do I walk away with after seeing this? Findings are suggesting that the younger arrivals at preschool age are actually not more likely to enroll in college. We could say that then perhaps exposure is not a major mechanism that is influencing college going. We saw some differences in college going, but then those differences really appear to be coming from SES disparities. The results might suggest indirect evidence for immigrant selectivity. Why? Because we see better college going outcomes from students coming from more advantaged backgrounds. The theory told us that social capital matters, but empirically, what are we seeing? We're possibly seeing that students that are planning to attend college are more likely than to talk about college with someone, and then subsequently perhaps more likely to enroll. Although this is the implication, this data is is not able to show a causal connection. This data also doesn't measure whether students reached out to counselors on their own, whether counselors reached out to students. So that is not able to be addressed here. But we do see that overall, even though it's a nationally representative sample, it seems to capture an overall advantaged group. This data also has a number of other challenges. It has this level of age at arrival detail that other data sets don't have, but it lacks information on, for instance, immigration status. And there's no measurement of content of what students actually talked to counselors about regarding college going. There's no measure of frequency, how often students spoke with counselors. And we also don't know about the mode of communication, being in recent modern times and technology. Was it over email, text, things like that? Finally, we don't know whether the conversations met students' needs. As HSLS didn't ask these questions, and HSLS, although it includes a sample of immigrant students, it was not designed to capture a large sample of immigrant youth. All these limitations that I mentioned with you tell me that perhaps HSLS, the data set, it's not able to tell us the whole story. So I think that there might be more to this story, which leads me to my dissertation prospectus, where I'm proposing a mixed method study that would address these broad data constraints and also gaps in the literature. The objective would be to examine college information gathering and to understand supporting and constraining mechanisms among 1.5 gen immigrant youth in their college-going pursuits. The study that I have just shared with you would be expanded upon to potentially use state fixed effects approach that would adjust for unobserved differences between states. This would reflect how there are different policies towards immigrants in different states, some states being more immigrant friendly, some being less. If we consider, for instance, tuition and assistance with tuition, state policies might potentially signal differences in immigrant students' behaviors in terms of whether they do or do not speak to school staff about their post-secondary plans. Study 2 and 3 in a moment would be the mixed method part that would first quantitatively examine 1.5 gen youth's college information gathering through a survey, an original data collection that will actually ask students, how did it go? How often did you meet with your counselor? What did you talk about? Study 3 would be a subsample of the surveyed students that would ask qualitative questions, trying to understand how social capital resources for immigrant students might hinder or might support their college-going pursuits. And also, how are students navigating these mechanisms? What are they doing with the information that they are receiving? The survey would be administered at 3 study locations, with subsample interviews as well. This would allow for a comparison of immigrant student experiences across 3 types of higher educational institutions. One would be a high-ranking research university, one would be a lesser-ranking university, and a community college. The survey would ask the types of questions such as, what did you discuss with your counselor? How often did you meet? And of course, how did you communicate? What type of mode of communication, and what did the conversation meet your needs? It would also ask about the role of peers. Maybe peers are helping students to find their way in the college-going path. The survey and the subsample interviews would be of freshman students at both the university and the community college locations, so that their experiences are relatively fresh in their mind. Overall, there are 3 main contributions. One is the empirical one, in that there's a great need to look at 1.5 gens, since that there's a scarcity of such data, and we have little understanding about how social capital works for this population, how students navigate supports and barriers if they're foreign born. The second would be to add nuanced understanding to theoretical disagreements about immigrant disadvantage. This is the idea where some immigrant youth have better educational outcomes relative to natives, but there are reasons for that, depending on where students come from in terms of their country, the SES in their home country, their family SES, and perhaps other nuanced things that we do not yet understand well. And finally, this would help to design a future surveys and help identify sources of inequality to inform educational intervention that might target that intervention towards immigrant students in states like California and other states that have a high immigrant population. The overall goal is to make college, but more broadly social mobility, more accessible, not only for immigrant students, but for others as well who are limited by social capital. And with that, I conclude.